Hola, buenos dias. Hello and welcome to our fireside chat with visionary thinker and sustainability pioneer John Elkington. It's really a pleasure to have John with us today. For those who might not be familiar, John is a world-renowned authority on corporate sustainability and sustainable development, though he would humbly deny it.
Something's going on.
He's also the founder of several influential organizations, Sustainability and Volans, and is widely credited with coining the phrase triple bottom line, which emphasizes the importance of people, profit, and planet for business decision making. So without further ado, please extend a warm welcome to John Elkington. It's such a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you, Laura. Good morning. Hola, buenos dias.
So this is our second South Summit in already this year, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention the flooding that has occurred in Porto Alegre since we were last there, and note the charitable work that South Summit has focused on their website. So for those that would like to contribute to the individuals that have been impacted by that devastation, please look online for those charities. And in many ways, this is actually a very, very appropriate segue to our conversation, thinking about the importance of nature considerations in businesses. So let's begin by having you tell us, John, about the fish in the business suit.
The fish in the business suit. Back in 1991, I got a cartoonist who worked then and still works for the Financial Times, a business newspaper, to do me a cartoon that was my first attempt to explain what the triple bottom line would eventually articulate. So it had a fish in a business suit, one side of a board table with all of the board rows on it. Then it had a woman who was very obviously from the global south, possibly India, Pakistan, wherever. And then it had a robot. And at that stage, the robot was almost a joke. It was saying, we've got to think about the long-term future. But now it's fascinating to see in boardrooms, expert systems, AI, increasingly present around the table. And in some ways, that's necessary because the challenges that we're now facing are so complex. The human brain, the standard issue human brain, is very often not up to it, particularly ones with MBAs, with apologies to anyone in the audience who has an MBA.
Well, clearly you were ahead of your time in anticipating what I think we're now seeing, which is an evolution from businesses thinking about climate neutrality to needing to think about nature positivity. And as a really innovative thinker in that respect, can you speak to some of the ways that you're seeing this trend and this focus evolve? I think we're just on the cusp of really seeing how businesses are evolving this thinking.
Well, maybe I can start with a public health warning. I mean, I came into this space as a child, fascinated by nature. That's what got me started. But over time, you mentioned the triple bottom line and sustainability. That was an attempt to say, and around the issue of the natural environment, there are social dimensions, economic dimensions, political dimensions, and so on. The way I think about it is in 1975 to 1986, in what was becoming Silicon Valley, a small group of people got together and they set up something called the Homebrew Computer Club. And these were people who were really interested in personal computing. So Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, the two founders of Apple, were part of that. And I think we're at that same stage again with nature-based solutions. Not simply how do you conserve wildlife, how do you protect nature, but how do you, over time, work with nature as a partner to deliver some of the really critical, deliver against some of the really critical challenges that or needs that we now have. So I think we're early on in a boom. The question is, when is that boom going to happen? Will it be just one, or will it be many? I think it will be many.
Yeah, and it's such a powerful way to reframe this thinking of nature positivity. And when we know that more than half of the global GDP is somewhat reliant or moderately or highly reliant on nature, it makes an abundance of sense for us to rethink this model and to move from extractive to regenerative and stewardship-based models. So I think that's a great point about nature-based solutions. One of the things that we're seeing a lot of is evolutions in technology as it relates to nature-based solutions. How are you seeing that space?
Well, I think technology is advancing so rapidly, as you all know, on so many different fronts. It's difficult from day to day to say exactly what's happening. But part of what I do is to go out and visit people developing new areas of science, new areas of technology, and then the business models to wrap around them. And I've been to see people like, before it was acquired by Google, DeepMind in London, and talk to younger AI engineers there. And one thing that really struck me was that firstly, they were about a third my age. Their brains worked about 17 times faster than mine worked. But they were all, without exception, interested in sustainability and particularly in the sort of the nature side. So I think there is this interest, at least potentially, in some of the people who are developing these new technologies. The challenge is, I worked through 15, 20 years of the very early days of genetic engineering and biotechnology, visited hundreds of companies in that space. And early on, people were talking about, we're going to clean up toxic waste sites, we're going to create new forms of renewable energy, we're going to do all these wonderful things. No, it went straight down to cancer and it went straight down to HIV/AIDS. All important targets, incidentally, but a lot of these wider applications disappeared. I think we have to be very careful that the same doesn't happen again, where, for example, AI just goes wholeheartedly into defense and military applications rather than some of the things that we'd like to see happen.
Absolutely. I've had the pleasure recently of working with an organization called the Nature Tech Collective, and they're pulling together a lot of very innovative startups that are thinking about nature technology. And just to give our audience some examples, this ranges from bioacoustics to environmental DNA to satellite imagery, and we're thinking about the ways that data can be leveraged to help businesses understand their footprints and their impact on nature, which I think is one of the gaps that businesses are grappling with right now. And we've talked in the past about pros and cons of technology, and maybe you can share some of your thoughts on this as well.
Well, just in case people in the audience don't know what bioacoustics it involves measuring the sound patterns coming out of wild populations of animals. And it's a way of detecting health or lack of health. And you mentioned also the DNA sampling. You now have technologies where you can go, for example, into an ecosystem like the Serengeti and detect every species that is in that ecosystem. So potentially hugely helpful. But imagine, for example, if it's then used for people who want to harvest the species. I mean, whales. I remember reading a science fiction novel by Arthur C. Clarke back in the late 60s, which was about whale farming. So we'll measure these whale populations, we'll listen to their songs, but at some stage we'll start herding them up and doing something quite different. So I'm not skeptical about technology. I think we're going to have to live with it. We're going to have to get in very early and influence some of the companies and teams working on this, but it can go a number of different ways over time.
Yeah, no, I think it's wise to be aware of all of these different pros and cons, but certainly it is inspiring to see the ways that we're able to appreciate and understand nature that we couldn't without having some of this remote sensing technology, and that's bringing a lot of life to it. But personally, I've seen how this can also be used in instances. I live in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem with wolves, so there's a balance to unleashing all of this. So hopefully it can be more of a force for good. Businesses are also seeing, I think, a lot of increased regulation and policy, and this is driving, particularly in Europe, I would say, companies to embrace what is now a nature-positive agenda. What are you hearing from some of the businesses that you work with about this transition?
Well, we work with businesses right the way around the world. It is true at the moment that the European Union is producing often more regulations and new rules and standards than it is the sort of innovation that we need, despite the Green Deal and so on. And you look at regulation, what's 47,000 pages of that now, and quite often regulating way ahead of the technology, getting to the point where some of that stuff would be necessary. So I think we have to approach this with a certain degree of balance. Things have to be regulated, but they also have to be enabled and funded in the right way. Just two things very quickly. One is, many people think about biomimicry when they think about nature. How can we use natural models? So Velcro, for example, something we've all used, comes from a thistle or a burr. If you've had vaccinations recently, you think, well, actually, that didn't hurt as much as the vaccination I had as a child. That's true, because the needles are now based on the way in which a mosquito goes in after your blood. So that's biomimicry. But some of you may have been part of the session yesterday with Jack Hiddery from Google's spin-out Sandbox. And he was talking about the way in which GPS now is being disrupted by the Russians, the Baltic states, and Ukraine, the Chinese. I'm sure we're trying to do elements of it as well. But that's becoming a real problem. You can't fly an airliner now safely over the Baltic states. So there are people now working on alternatives to GPS. And one of the things that they've used as a sort of spur, as a model, is the way in which migrating birds use their retina to see magnetic fields in the Earth's surface. So they're using that model. But I think that's very often what happens. We use models from nature rather than treating nature properly as a partner. Then to your question about the business side, a lot of this still is you're going to have to report on your nature-based footprint, your ecological footprint or whatever. It's still seen to be about risk management and a weeny bit of a threat. It's not yet, except for a few exceptional companies and some exceptional people in those companies, seen as this is probably one of the biggest opportunities of our lifetime. And if we don't crack the biodiversity and nature problem, we're not going to crack the climate problem. These things are so intimately interlinked. So people are waking up, but not yet quite as fast as I think we would want them to.
Yeah, and I think this awareness that we don't solve the climate crisis without nature and intact nature is one of the things that's shifting the focus. And I agree with you that we don't want to become so intent on following regulations that we lose sight of what I think the opportunity in biodiversity is, which is an outcome-based approach. And there seems to be so much enthusiasm because there is this palpability in biodiversity and nature that we don't see as much with greenhouse gas emissions and climate. So let's hope we can keep that inspiration. And I think to your point about biomimicry, this is such a powerful way of doing that, and making sure that we are learning from nature and being inspired by the innovation that we see in the natural world and not losing sight of this is really important. I think you work with the founder of the Biomimicry Institute, and she coins it basic training for earthlings, which is just the understanding of how we relate to the natural world and the way we can learn from 3.8 billion years of refined intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, the way I think about the business side of this is that for business generations, certainly many decades now, chemistry, industrial chemistry, physics, mathematics, those have been and statistics have been really crucial disciplines for business thinking and operations. In the 21st century, the rest of it, biology and ecology are going to come racing up the priority list for businesses. But if you ask most of the businesses that we work with, who on the board, who in the C-suite, who have got biological qualifications, it's actually a relatively limited group of people, unless you happen to be in healthcare, and then they're interested in, antibiotics and things like that. Not quite yet in what we're interested in, which is ecosystem management. So I think whether people appoint non-executive directors to their board, they set up advisory boards, or whatever it is, they need to have biologists involved. And one of the things that we often advise and help people do is just get out and meet some of the people doing some of the fundamental research work in this space. So Janine Benyus at Biomimicry Institute, I don't see a huge queue outside their offices from business people wanting to understand properly what they're doing and what they might do to support that and learn from that. So a lot of work still to be done.
And I can't help but think in the way that chief sustainability officers serve as that translating role within businesses between boards and divisions within companies, that perhaps we see an evolution to heads of nature that are able to help businesses understand this, and connections between pollination and crop production for commodity businesses, and the links between cancer research, obviously, and nature. The fact that over 70% of businesses are dependent on at least one ecosystem service. So I think there is a bridge to be made there. And on that point, maybe, do you have any advice for the startups and the businesses in the room as to how they might, even if their businesses don't seem to be nature-related and purpose-aligned, we've established that these connections are very, very important. Business resilience is nature resilience. How might some of these earlier stage startups consider this?
Yeah, I think very often startups are so busy surviving and raising funding and refining their business model and all the rest of it, they don't have much time for the wider world. But that wider world is massively significant to successful businesses. So if they want to be on that trajectory to success, they have to early on start to understand what's going to be required of them as a successful business in terms of the social impact of what they do, and you see that in AI increasingly, the nature-related impacts. And I think that very often, if you ask questions of people who are now just beginning to come into your businesses, are you interested in this space? Would you be interested in doing a little bit more work in this space? It's amazing how often the answer is yes. I mean, younger people are really, really fascinated by some elements of this. Final point. Chief Sustainability Officers, have one if you must. Really, really helpful. There are hundreds of these people. I think you were one as well. But they're not all yet as proficient in some of the skills that they would need in order to be tackling some of the challenges that we need. So have a Chief Sustainability Officer, but don't simply rely on him or her.
Well, there's never enough time, John, but before we let you go, congratulations on what will soon be the launch of your 21st book, Tickling Sharks. So I hope that that others in the audience will have a chance to read that, but I know that it's a great read. And thank you for the work you do in the world and for your contributions to this space over many decades. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you, Lara, and thank you all this morning for being here. Thanks.